Thursday already, and wow, we're already 10 minutes into class. I guess I showed up maybe a couple minutes tardy and it took a while to set up. And this is probably near the end. Yeah. So this is some of the best film footage of this part of the river. This is the kind of the heart of the mid-Columbia. You know, about kind of, you can mark the upper end of the gorge. The eastern edge of the gorge is here. And Celilo Falls, roughly where the Dalles. So this area was about 9 miles upriver from the town and from the dam, from the Dalles. And then the whole next 40 or 50 miles of river was kind of similar. Not a lot of falls like that, but more whitewater. And historians or writers of that era describe that as a part of the river where the river turned on its edge, just because its channel became much narrower and therefore as a result became much deeper. And there just are a lot of basalt rock, mostly basalt rock formations in through there. Pretty amazing place, really, just geologically. The gorge is, you know, that whole section from before there was water, but certainly before there was wildlife, you know, that area was carved out by the great Missoula floods. You know, where there were several of. I guess I don't know that much about it, the Missoula floods, but think of a 100-foot wall of water traveling at 50 miles an hour, 80 miles, I don't know. Just think of a huge wall of water. So those giant ice dams that formed in the last ice age broke free Lake Missoula, which covered, you know, most of Montana and Wyoming and that whole part of North America. Those ice dams broke, and all of a sudden, it's huge. And that happened several times. You know, they froze back up again, and they broke. Anyway, and that's probably why we are blessed if we can use such language to have a river that carves its way just right through the mountains, just plows its way right through the mountains, which is unprecedented, really. It's the only river that does that makes its way through the band of large mountains that extends from British Columbia all the way down. Here we call it the Cascades, right? In California they call it the Sierra Nevada. But if you look on a map, you know, the Colorado skirts around south, right? It goes into the Gulf of California, but the Columbia is the only river. And arguably, you could make an argument about the Klamath, perhaps, but the Klamath really just starts in the high desert and then just kind of goes down from there. You know, it doesn't really carve its way through the mountains. Anyway, so geologically, you know, there are 3 different layers of meaning, if you will. Geological layer of meaning in the Columbia Gorge, and then the biological layer, of which salmon are, of course, a huge, significant part. Salmon, sturgeon, and lamprey are the 3 commercially valuable anadromous fish. All meaning uprunning. They all, like salmon, they live in their adult lives in the ocean, and they come up and spawn in the fresh water. And then the cultural layer, of course, which is evident, which of course we just observed, the cultural layer of the meaning and significance of this place, Celilo Falls, and that entire section of the river. There were the traditional fishing sites. Those places are those places in the river, like between Celilo Falls and where Bonneville now stands, which is pretty much the stretch of the gorge, right, the Columbia Gorge, where Bonneville Dam is, the lower end, and then from there on down, it's all estuary, right? There's tidal influence all the way up to Bonneville Dam, right? So that's all considered the lower river. And then the mid-river starts at Bonneville, right? The mid-Columbia starts at Bonneville and goes up quite a ways, really all the way up into northern Washington, I think, you know, until it gets up into the... And it's dammed all the way, so we'll get into that. But this area was submerged through utilitarian reasoning primarily, and a lot of misinformation, a lot of bad science, bad stuff, bad information posing as science. Resulted in the loss of this, or at least the temporary loss of this particular, you know, you could describe it in a million different ways. If you're interested, there are a lot of resources, hundreds and hundreds of historic photographs. The most photographed place in the world, it's been described. A place where wherever you look, there was a picture. But anyway, you know, that's and that may be romantic, you know, and that sounds kind of the way that, and it is, the way that non-native people, non-indigenous, as Westerners describe the pretty places, right? the language used to describe Celilo Falls was totally reminiscent, totally consistent with the language that those people, the same people used to describe Yosemite and Grand Canyon, and right, very, very pretty high scenic value. But the utilitarian values of damming that section of the river eventually overrode, according to the reasoning of the people who made these decisions, right? They were confronted with these decisions about how to manage these resources. And in those days, there was probably still quite a bit, not probably, there was still quite a bit of, and there is still to this day, sadly, of racial animosity and a feeling that the ongoing presence of indigenous people fishing here and exercising their fishing rights was sort of an affront to progress, perhaps, and perhaps an affront to the sensibilities of some of the people who own property in that area. So the decision was made that there was some consideration to put the Dalles Dam above Celilo Falls and thereby save, and that would mean that there would be still a wild section of the river left, where the reservoir behind Bonneville Dam, and as you go upstream, eventually, presumably, if they'd left this intact, then it would be wild, right? Still, at least it would still be free flowing, and the Celilo Falls would still be there. But when they calculated everything, they realized that the kilowatt production that you would obtain from siting the dam above Celilo Falls was so dramatically lower than the kilowatt production that you get if you put it where it is now. And now it's one of I think it might be the biggest, it and John Day Dam, which I believe is the next one up, are the two big power generating dams and McNary too, I think, which is the one after that. The first four. Anyway, but this one in particular, the Dalles Dam, the one that flooded, and they located it there just, again, for utilitarian reasons. And it's perhaps worthwhile to think about to speculate about whether or not such a proposal, had it arrived on the scene, on the political landscape, say 10 or at least 30 years later, maybe 20, maybe even just 10 years later, whether or not our society would, given the go-ahead, to do this. But anyway, so I envision talking about the harvest part. I believe that's how I have it laid out in the syllabus. But anyway, every term in this course, we have to spend a week. We have to spend not one whole class, but our natural resource management's moral struggle management topic for the day, for this whole week, is supposed to be the Columbia Basin salmon fishery as a whole. We could throw in we ought to really, the other anadromous fish that are part of the Columbia snake salmon fishery as a whole. We could throw in the lamprey. Especially lamprey are very valuable, and they have kind of a symbiotic relationship with salmon too. So when the lamprey are struggling, then the salmon are certainly struggling. Well, I would like all of you to just start thinking about our ecosystem as a salmon cycle, a salmon ecosystem, and humans have been for a long time, let's say, and have done this in what we moderners might call a sustainable way, a perfectly sustainable way, and a scientifically rich and very knowledgeable way, have managed and related to this resource for, there's controversy, at least 12,000 years, we know that that's confirmed. Before the last ice age receded, there were people living here, so at least maybe 12, 15. But other people, and of course, if you ask the descendants of this man fishing right here, I suspect they'd say time immemorial, and then they would leave it up to you to decide what that meant, perhaps, or perhaps they'd even just narrow it down even more and say, we were created here. This is where we emerged. This is where our creation story told us we emerged as people in the form that we are now. And who knows what that means? Maybe they mean the cultural form that they are now. In any event, they're not ignorant, and they're certainly not Luddites, native people as a whole, and they're not ignorant of science, but their stories aren't necessarily in conflict with a Western scientific account of where they come from and how long they've been there. Perhaps to be perhaps a fair, if we're to take European science and anthropology and archaeology really, really super seriously, but still listen to the native point of view, to the indigenous story that says we've been here forever, right? Perhaps 45, 50,000 years is more accurate, is a fair estimate of how long these cultures have been here. But the point is that they've been aware of this resource for all that whole time, and they've been relying upon it as their primary source of protein for all that time, right? And so it's worth talking about. It's worth talking about indigenous culture a little bit, mainly just from from every kind of perspective, really. But I feel competent, qualified to talk about the history and to some extent the relationship and perhaps the sense of the moral dimensions of the relationship that indigenous people have. But I wrote when I was finishing law school, we had to do a senior paper, and I had planned the whole time, to work on it really hard and publish it, and that all worked out. I published it, and it's about the history of treaty fishing rights in the Pacific Northwest. It's just a law review article. It doesn't really gets into a little philosophy at the end, but it's just sketches the history of our U.S. federal court's interpretations of the Stevens treaties. In particular, the key wording, the fisheries clause, the fishing clause in the Stevens treaties has had tremendous legal ramifications, and kind of an amazing story. So I'll go over some of that today, all right? And I think that maybe now what we'll do is we'll end up picking up both an indigenous perspective, perhaps, although we should feel a little uncomfortable trying to do that unless someone happens to be an indigenous person. But we can also certainly pick up the ecofeminist perspective, and then finally, at some point, I do want to break up into groups and debate. I don't know if today is the day to do that, because I kind of want to get through this other material on social ecology and technology, and the essay by David Watson that I want to go into more, and then I also want to go into the history of treaty fishing rights, which supposedly was going to be on the menu on Tuesday, right? But we didn't get to it. So it got moved up to today. And my friend, it's another point that I have to make. Steve Hawley got called away out of the country for some kind of journalistic interest or story. And so that was a surprise. And I neglected to mention this. I learned about this a whole week ago, and I neglected to mention it last class, and I could have mentioned it last week even, that portion of our curriculum unfortunately has had to be canceled. But Steve Hawley has written 2 books now on the Snake River, the second of which was just published, just very recent, or might be on the verge, but it's done anyway. And he was going to talk to us about his new book too. It was going to be really cool. But he had to cancel, so that's not happening. It looks like it's just me. You got me for the whole rest of the term. Me to talk a little bit about the history of treaty fishing rights, and me to talk also to try to, to the extent that we cover ecofeminism at all, which is a huge sprawling subject with a lot of diversity, just as much diversity within way more diversity within ecofeminism than there is even within environmental pragmatism. Certainly than there is within, probably almost certainly too, than there is within deep ecology. So there's no way you can cover ecofeminism in one class, obviously. But we'll read this kind of a follow-up essay, really is what it is, written 20 or 30 years after the publication of her famous book called The Death of Nature. And 20 or 30 years later, just a few years ago, she published Carolyn Merchant. She's a history professor, and she's a professor of history at UC Berkeley, and she specializes in the history of 17th century European intellectual development. So she has this fascinating thesis about the death of nature, which is not that anything physically dies, although perhaps it begins to kind of wither on the vine, ecologically speaking, because that's the moment at which nature loses its interiority, right? Nature loses its enchantment, nature loses its subjectivity, nature loses the possibility of basing any kind of moral status on in a non-human entity, right? And it becomes just a resource. It becomes hollowed out of all interiority and becomes nothing but form and matter, right? So that's what we'll go over next week too. So anyway, we have a lot more. Yes.
Is that based on like empiricist philosophers? Does it begin there? Or where?
Yeah, she actually goes after old Francis Bacon pretty vigorously, and attributes a lot of the warping of Western views of nature to the scientific method, Bacon in particular. We're kind of picking up some bigger pieces of the puzzle that I've been trying to put together with all of your guys' help all term long. And one of the bigger pieces of the puzzle is the puzzle of how our culture got to be so dysfunctional in its relationship with ecological wholes and biota. By the way, that's the new language I like to speak about, right? That's what we've been interested in all term long. The moral dimensions of our relationships with biota, that means any living thing, and ecological wholes. And if we started with deep ecology, we would have been delighted, right? As pre-critical thinkers and before we understood some of the infirmities of deep ecology, because they would offer us both, right? They'd offer us the biocentric egalitarianism, which would totally resonate with our concern that we have for biota, right? Which is what we're all, not necessarily, about in our personal lives, but in the environmental ethics class, described as an effort to understand the moral dimensions of our relationships with biota and ecological wholes. That's kind of a clear way of describing our journey that we've taken this term. Another actually good way and fruitful way of describing our journey, though, is, I'm never really too concerned about this microphone because it always seems to work wherever it is. Anyway, we've been trying to discover or describe various cultural productions of norms regarding natural resources, right? The cultural production of norms regarding our human treatment of natural resources. And we did all that meta-ethical work because we kind of approached that question from the point of view from a more abstract philosophical point of view. We tried as best as we could, and then we kind of ended up having to abandon that project after we read Thomas Burge, and then we got into the deep ecology stuff, right? But we tried to chase after this question of how ought we to think about the moral status of ecological wholes, right? As though there is a right way of thinking about the moral status of ecological wholes. And then, and we explored these purely anthropocentric ways of making sense of it through Norton, right? He's just an anthro-holist. He just wants to expand the anthro community to include all kinds of future generations, 100, 200, 400 years down the road. And he wants to include people on the other side of the globe, right? Global humans all the way around. And that may be enough to describe what we're looking for, right? The moral a way of thinking about the moral status of of biota and ecological wholes. And then we explored Collicutt, who thinks that's not good enough. Norton's explanation is not good enough because it's too anthropocentric, right? It says that ecological wholes and biota don't actually have any moral status. We just ought to treat them as though they do. And that seems like tepid, lukewarm kind of wishy-washy stuff, right? To someone like Collicutt and to someone like Rolston too, right? So Collicutt compromises, and he has this elegant argument about how once humans come along and recognize the crucial, absolutely vital importance of an ecological whole and of its integrity and its stability and its beauty, then humans are going to do this magical conferral of rights upon it, right? And so it both has objective status as having rights, but it's also ultimately subjective because it's based on humans' considerations of what's good for them long term, right? It's consequentialist, resolutely consequentialist. And that may be the fatal flaw of Collicutt's land ethic, right? And his reading of Leopold's land ethic. Leopold may be more of a neo-Kantian, may be much more of a non-consequentialist, whose point is that the moral status of the ecological whole is inside of the ecological whole itself, right? Or it's in the unfolding of that ecological whole, right? It's in the talic trajectory, for example, of a species over many, 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 many generations, right? Making a talic course through its environment, right? There are all kinds of different ways of describing, perhaps, the way Rolston does, the way Bookchin does, the objective features of natural history, right? Of evolutionary history. and then deriving some kind of moral norm. Either the moral norm says that, well, we know now that it has this magic stuff. It has autopoieticness or something like that. Therefore, we know it has some kind of moral status. Therefore, we know it's morally wrong for humans, right? There's the old familiar neocon. That because it has this status, we can't reduce it, right? And we know as ecologists that harming its wholeness, by harming its integrity or its stability, automatically, implicitly reduces it, right? Impermissibly reduces it. So from a neo-Kantian perspective, you have this kind of ironclad argument. You just appeal to all the evidence that ecologists and biologists have mustered over the last 100 years of their sciences, right? And you put that all together and you realize that we have these hard and fast relationships that are unchangeable, that are chemical and physical, like what's happening in the atmosphere, right? When we add so much of particles such and such to the atmosphere, then the atmosphere responds and the climate systems, Earth's climate systems respond in a certain way, right? And we know that, right? So a neo-Kantian is going to say that unless you completely abandon the idea that 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years down the road matters, morally matters, right, to whatever humans are there, unless you totally abandon that idea, then obviously you have moral obligations that come right along with your empirical observations, right? Because those empirical observations implicate vital needs, absolutely vital needs. And as the pragmatists and any of these thinkers are going to acknowledge, vital needs implicate moral claims, right? And the more strong, the more vital the need, the stronger the moral claim is, to the point where it becomes just absolute, right? So, let's see. Try to do a little bit of an analysis that perhaps that's what we'll pick up from from Carolyn Merchant next Tuesday, that you'll read over the weekend, okay? You'll read her suggestion that we adopt a partnership ethic to replace the dominator ethic that she believes, in her historical expertise, began to crystallize and really gain inertia and movement in the 17th century, right? Partly through the work, and that kind of informs a lot of my own scholarship too, in the way that I teach this class too, right? Because I often cite old Francis Bacon. I have a much she's been able to just dispense with them, right? You know, and just kind of, she attacks them quite vigorously in some of her other work. And I have a hard time going down that path with her. And some of her criticisms are as a historian, her thesis that it was this Bacon's scientific method itself that results in domination, I think that might not be correct. But anyway, that's her area of expertise, and you know, and she might say that it's clear because it's documented. As a historian, you can go look. There are all kinds of documents that if you study them, they disclose to us actually how people lived their lives in those days. It's not that far ago, right? It's early modern period, and so it's a much more it's a much less tenuous thesis, for example, than someone like what's her, Rihanna Eisler, who wrote this famous book called The Chalice and the Blade, who's talking about, I think, thousands of years ago, right? Western cultures before they were invaded by Platonism and Abrahamic religion, right? And that's a kind of a more questionable theory, right? Because we don't have documentation from that time period, right? We just have to go on the basis of old things, you know, old artifacts that they dug up out of the dirt, right? It's really hard to put together how people actually interrelated. So Carolyn Merchant's going to say, well, look, you know, I can show you exactly how in the 17th century the relationship between humans and nature became problematic, perhaps, is one way of saying it. Because whereas before nature was invested with some moral significance, right? And that protected what we did. You know, we were constrained in what we did to the natural world, because the natural world was still an enchanted place, to use her language. And then it was in the 17th and 18th century, historically, that cultures began to move away from the idea that nature is an enchanted place and began to move increasingly toward the idea that nature is just a set of utilities, and that gives us license, right, to completely conquer for our own benefit. And then perhaps the puzzle becomes, well, why would we not do that, right? Because the reading of human beings that goes along with it is perfectly consistent with the idea that we ought to do that. That's the way humans, that's the way everything in nature operates, right? To pursue its own gain. So, of course, indigenous people have a very different view of the moral dimension of our relationships. You know, it doesn't have to do with what's good for us in the long term. In any event, so David Watson gives us really kind of a remarkable analysis of the history of technology, and perhaps a frightening analysis. And obviously you need to take it with a grain of salt, and I think perhaps it's consistent with this literary tradition of deep ecology, or the literary tradition of social ecology, you know? I mean, and it's kind of hard to know what to do. He does offer us some practical suggestions about what we might do. And that reminds me, though, that you know, where we're going for the rest of this term, we're going to go first to, I sent myself a little email too. Where is it? Is that it? Yeah. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to conclude the term with virtue ethics, with environmental virtue ethics, which is another huge topic that we don't have enough time to give any fair, you know, attention to. But we're slowly working our way toward it, okay? We move from Thomas Birch, and maybe from what I've tried to reconstruct through Birch and through Norton as an environmental pragmatist school of environmental ethics, and then we move to deep ecology, and now we've moved to a third school of environmental ethics, broadly speaking, you know, through the work of Murray Bookchin, which we're describing as social ecology, and then we'll do virtue ethics. But virtue, personal excellence is our goal, okay? And for those people who are looking for an answer to the question of what ought I to do, for those people who are looking for an action norm, right? Certainly you can find that. You can get directed that way from taking an ethics class. And one result, one of the fruits of ethics certainly is cultural criticisms, right? But every cultural criticism you find is going to be based on something that looks a lot like the different normative theories and different approaches to natural resources that we've been looking at all term long. So I think I've given you, we now have a fair and comprehensive view of the landscape of different theories, right? So how are they going to help you in terms of action? You know, we have a sick culture, clearly, and a sick political culture. Our body politic is very corrupt, as I've pointed out time and time again throughout the term. Personal excellence, though, is something we can still achieve despite the corruption. So if you're a political-minded person, then I encourage you to keep going, you know, and keep going with an eye toward whether you're working for what might be described as an environmental organization or an environmental justice organization or a social justice organization. Keep working toward that. And from an environmental ethics point of view, remember that Thomas Birch's point, which is we ought to keep an eye on what we're actually working to do, which is to heal our relationship with ecological wholes and the other biota, right? Our culture is much too anthropocentric, and that's why we need to take care to set aside more wilderness. Not because wilderness is valuable in and of itself, because it's part of a larger struggle to maintain our own humanity, right? By maintaining our relationships with places like Celilo Falls. Those relationships themselves, you know, I try to give you the big picture, right? And part of the big picture is our orca relatives. Well, that's why I like to talk about those guys too, right? And if you look at this part of Earth from the moon, and you somehow have biological glasses on, and you can see the biota, right? They're somehow highlighted. I guarantee you what you'll see from the moon. You'll see those orcas in Puget Sound, and you'll see the connection between those orcas, their communities, and the Snake River salmon, right? And all the salmon that get pumped annually and seasonally, 3 or 4 times a year, right? The heart of the Columbia Basin just contracts and sends all these red blood cells, right? However you want to describe it. Maybe the ocean is where the heart is, and they're the one that makes more sense, right? Every time those adult salmon feel the need, as a group, you know, as a whole community, thousands at a time, they all migrate. And they're the red blood cells bringing the necessary nutrients from the North Pacific. The densest biomass on the planet, right? From the North Pacific, pulsing it up in every little artery, every little vein, right? And every one of them biologically distinct, having a certain set of ecological challenges to overcome, right, over many, many generations. The genetic signature of a place, right? Thousands and thousands and thousands of genetic signatures all through the Columbia Basin. But so politically, you know, that's why I like to talk about those indigenous fishing sites, because they represent the cultural piece of the puzzle. They do, right? Historically, at least, and who knows? I mean, we can rework the whole system as long as we are salmon, right? And maybe they don't need to have those particular sites restored. Culturally, it would be nice. It seems like it would be more beneficial on the whole to be able to drive